Good morning, I'm Mike Rabel. Today we're going to start talking of the Constitution of the United States. And in a brief overview, what we have is a document which in theory enumerates and limits the powers of the federal government. We'll talk in other lessons where that isn't exactly how it has come to pass, but that is certainly what the Founding Fathers envisioned. In order to do that, what we really have to look back to is this document, the Magna Carta, which was signed at Runnymede by King John in 1215. A lot of people think, why would it be important what happened in England 800 years ago? Well, apart from the fact that this was the first time that the king had his power limited directly by the nobility, it wasn't for the common people, what was also significant is that it was reduced to writing. Now, granted, it was written in Latin, which was at that time the scholarly language the clerics primarily kept it, and so this wasn't a document meant for widespread dissemination. But what is important about it is the king made concessions. Now, again, most of these concessions didn't involve the common man, but it was the first limitations on government. Until then, there was something called the divine right of kings, which meant he was the king because God wanted him to be the king. And as such, he had unlimited power. At Runnymede, King John gave up a great deal of those powers. There's never been another John in the history of England. You should be thankful as a student of American government because our Constitution is written. The British Constitution, if you were to sit down with someone and say, well, I'd like to see a copy of the British Constitution, you'd be somewhat at a loss because it's comprised of documents including the Magna Carta, the Petition of Rights, the Bill of Rights, a variety of statutes, and some of it is just custom. Whereas in the United States, they actually sat down, our founding fathers sat down in Philadelphia in 1787 and set forth what their concept of the government was going to be. That was a document we were supposed to live by. I think it's changed a lot, and that's a problem in the way that it has been interpreted, but we'll get to that when we deal with federalism and the Electoral College and things like that. The bottom line, though, is don't complain. It's much easier to be a student of the American Constitution than, for instance, the British Constitution. All right, now that I've convinced you how simple the American Constitution actually is, let's break down this fascinating document. Let's look a little bit at the history of it. The first governing document generally considered, other than the colonial charters, was called the Articles of Confederation. That was somewhat what they had now in the European Union. At that time, each of the states were considered essentially nations. They had the authority to deal in international relations with other countries as they saw fit. They had the ability to make laws governing import tariffs, that is, charging taxes on things brought into or taken out of the colony. And as such, they had a great deal of power. Clearly, they didn't want to give that power up. Anyone that has power doesn't want to give it up. That's simply a basic concept of political science. The states didn't want to give it up, so under the Articles of Confederation, what became United States of America got together and decided to provide for certain privileges that the states would show to each other. The main problem with the Articles of Confederation is it did not provide any true enforcement mechanism. It didn't provide any true way to raise revenue. And a government without money and without any way to really enforce its decisions is pretty much a paper tiger. So in 1787, the Founding Fathers got together. They were sent by the 13 colonies, the independent states at that time, under the Articles of Confederation. And the express purpose of what they were to accomplish that summer in Philadelphia was to overhaul the Articles of Confederation. It was not to draft an entirely new document, though that is in fact what the 55 of them did. They sealed the windows, they let no information out, they were very careful that no one really knew what the process was that was going on inside. This was done because what they were undertaking was an entirely revolutionary form of government, which ultimately is reflected in our Constitution, and we'll discuss the battle over ratification at a later date. But let's look at the basic structure of our Constitution and how elegantly it is set out. In Article 1, we have the legislative branch. That is the branch that is supposed to make laws, right? That's your House of Representatives, which will designate HR, and the Senate. And that's very simple. Legislature, the purpose is to make laws. In the second article, we have the executive branch. And that is just like what it sounds. He is to execute the laws. That is to ensure that they are carried out. And in fact, the Constitution specifically says in Article 2, which creates the executive branch, that he shall ensure that the laws are faithfully executed. That's even part of the oath of office that the executive is required to take. So he enforces the law for all intents and purposes. In theory, he will only enforce the laws that have been passed by the legislature. And the third great leg of the American government is the judiciary, whose job ultimately, as we'll discuss when we talk more about the third branch, is interpreting the law. So that when there is any sort of confusion, if you will, that comes up between the law as it was written by the legislature and the law as it is being implemented by the executive, they can turn to the third branch. And the third branch, if you really look at it, is given short shrift in the Constitution. The terms of the legislative branch is set very clearly. Members of the House of Representatives have 2-year terms. Members of the Senate used to be, at the time of drafting the Constitution, appointed by the states for a 6-year term. The executive, it was clearly set out, had a 4-year term. He was selected by the Electoral College. And thirdly, in the third article, the judiciary is set forth, and they are allowed to maintain their jobs as long as they have good behavior, which has been interpreted to mean once you're appointed and approved by the Senate, you have that job for life, unless you, for some reason, are impeached, which is basically the same process of impeachment that can be used for the executive branch. When the Constitution was originally drafted, it's interesting to note, of these 4 main bodies that were created, the House of Representatives, the Senate, the President, and the Supreme Court, and such other inferior tribunals as Congress may from time to time decide to create, of these 4 primary bodies, only one was to be elected by the people, and that was the House of Representatives. The states appointed the senators. The states were allowed to choose how the electors to the Electoral College would be selected. Now, we take for granted now that there's a popular vote, and in some states there are actually laws that require that the electors from a particular state cast their ballot for whomever won the popular vote in their state. Other states don't even have that. So we've had situations, as we'll discuss when we talk about the Electoral College, where you have what's called faithless electors. That is, people that do not vote for the person for whom they originally were pledged. And the judiciary clearly were never meant to be elected. The theory was that they would be politically insulated. They would be appointed by the president, approved by the Senate, a branch of the legislative arm, and they would then be able to act in autonomy in administering an interpretation of the law. The theory being that they would not then be beholden to public opinion or to politicians for their ongoing tenure in office. So that concludes our brief overview of the Constitution. We'll move into more of the specific areas and talk about some of the other topics in other lessons.